Good to have you with us on this Wednesday edition. Ed Schultz, news and commentary from the nation's capital. The polls. Think about everything that Donald Trump has been through, how controversial his campaign has been. The same with Hillary Clinton with the email dumps and the information. It's all boiling out. And they're tied. We're less than a week away. ABC News Washington Post poll has them at 46. The third-party candidates don't seem to be making any inroads whatsoever. This election is going to come down to who are you comfortable with. You're going to look at the world, you're going to see the issues, and you're going to say, okay, who do you think can handle it? That's where I think voters are going to go. Now, obviously, I'm a little different because it's health care for me. I don't trust the Republicans when it comes to health care. But when you look at the world right now and you look at all of the hotbeds that are unfolding and the issues internationally, this, in many respects, is a pretty tough decision. You could say, well, Hillary Clinton's got unbelievable experience. Well, maybe a change is good. That's where I think Americans are. A lot of Americans we don't trust Trump because he hadn't been there, done that. Hillary has much better prowess and much more moxie when it comes to the international stage. Trump keeps talking about how the military is behind him and all of these generals have signed on. I don't know what that means. This is going to come down to judgment, temperament, and who you, the voter, feels comfortable with running the country. This is a man who I have immense respect for, who was in the United States Navy for 30 years, Admiral Joe Sestak, former congressman from Pennsylvania, a real, true American who worked in intelligence and also has been big in public service throughout his entire life. Joe, good to have you with us on Ed Schultz News and Commentary.
Ed, it's good to be back with you. Thank you.
Who do you feel comfortable with? And what do you think this election is all about, generically speaking?
Answer to your first question, I am extraordinarily uncomfortable. In fact, I'd be apprehensive if Donald Trump were to be the commander-in-chief. When you talk about the use of nuclear weapons almost in a short-fused type of way, as though they might be used almost willy-nilly, it really does send you back to the early 60s and the concern we had about, Dr. Strangeglove and things. Second, I've had the opportunity to work with Secretary Clinton, both as a Secretary of State as well as when she was in the White House on veterans issues. And I think that understanding that she has gained about a steady hand, a thoughtful approach to our foreign affairs is one that will stand us in good stead. But in answer to your second question, Ed, I think at the end of the day, this issue, as you well spoke about it, setting it up, and you talked about both sides, and yet they're tied. I think this issue still goes to the deepest deficit we have in America today and why people are feeling the way they are. It's that feeling that, who do I really trust? I think, however, that when you define the issue on foreign policy as you did, that at the end of the day you will find that the trust factor with Trump, Mr. Trump, is in such a bigger deficit that they will go with Hillary Clinton and she will prevail in this choice.
I have immense respect for your career and knowledge, and I want your take on the Middle East. I mean, this is a hotbed, a boiling bowl that we have never seen before. A lot of things converging into one spot. I don't know how we unpack it. I don't know how we settle things down. We haven't seen anything like Aleppo since the Vietnam War. And policy is so terribly important, yet we get very little conversation on the campaign trail about exactly what either candidate would do if they were commander-in-chief in dealing with what seems to be constantly unraveling in the Middle East. What are your thoughts on Syria?
And Ed, this is really important what you said. I mean, here I do think people at the end of the day, many of us are going to think thoroughly over who am I comfortable with as commander-in-chief, not just president. And yet how little discussion beyond just some almost irrelevant comments by Donald Trump, and yet not great depth of detail on the other side is lacking out there. So in my opinion, the most important issue that has to be brought up for the Middle East is not in the sense of winning that battle, whichever one it is, Mosul or in Iraq or over in Syria. It's how do we secure the peace? What is it the day after? Do we really support the Syrian Kurds when we know that the Turks will not abide that? Mm-hmm. Do we really not align with the dictator of Syria, Assad, when we know that we just aren't going to be able to secure the peace unless he probably remains? You and I have talked about this over the past year or two, and my concern is that no one has yet thought about how do we secure the peace, and that's what they didn't do when we went into Iraq. They just wanted to topple Saddam. Today, I believe in Iraq we're doing what we must. ISIS can be territorially removed, even though there'll be pockets of resistance afterwards in Iraq. I think that's correct, what they're doing. It's hard. We got in late. We let them get within 60 miles of Baghdad before we stopped them. But in Syria, it has come almost to be a containment strategy. It is one where, unfortunately, we were slow. As I talked with you on your show a couple years ago of putting small arms to the more moderate rebels. And in my mind, when the red line was not held up by the president, we are almost reacting. We did not work closely with Russia initially, as I felt we should have, and we talked about. So today it is almost one more of containment, because if we do just help the Kurds, then who are the best fighting force, that just means the Turks will come in and won't permit it. And so trying to get some peaceful resolution with Assad remaining and Iran still having some influence there, because that's who they're aligned with, as long as we can bring about that peaceful resolution is probably the best step we can do right now.
So regime change is not something President Obama has talked about as of late. In fact, there has been very little explanation from this administration down the stretch in the last 6 months exactly what our mission is with Syria. Why do we want a regime change if that is still the goal at this point? It all seems very confusing to people who are trying to figure this out.
Yes, I think that this administration, unfortunately, is just waiting for the administration to end, because our administration period to end, because it is not about regime change. It cannot be any longer. Russia changed that dynamic permanently, and I would argue it never was really in the cards. Number two is I think that we have actually impaired our process here because of indecision. As you know, there was a National Security Council meeting about 2-3 weeks ago on the decision of additional arming. And as you read in the media, the decision wasn't to do it or not to do it. It was no decision. Mm-hmm. And so it's unfortunate, but no one is putting this out on the table with a right way forward, because a benchmark was set of regime change, just like a benchmark was set of a red line if Assad used chemicals, and it wasn't met. Mm-hmm. And the regime change is not possible now. And I think by changing the strategy publicly, unfortunately, the administration does not want to admit that, yes, it had the wrong strategy and it had become reactive. Now there's no action, and I think that is quite harmful.
Isn't the relationship between the United States and Russia, Russia and the United States, paramount to all of this? I mean, wouldn't that relationship and a jumpstart, restart, a reconfiguration, whatever you want to call it, wouldn't that be really the basis for something positive in the Middle East?
I think you're right. As a matter of fact, and Ed, I think it was with you, when we first, as Russia started to intervene, if you remember, we would not cooperate with them except for, we said, aircraft deconfliction. We would not share intelligence. And yet it was pretty obvious at that time that rather than telling Putin, as our president did, you're getting into a quagmire, you don't know what you're doing, he didn't see it through their prism. that, wait a minute, they've had a long toehold in that country. They weren't just stepping in. They used to use their ports all the time, never mind providing arms to Assad all the time. Yeah. They were at home there. And so our failure to actually have a close working relationship, and it's tough. I mean, in the Soviet Union days, even in my own experience, it's tough working with them. But that failure to say we will only deconflict, nothing more, meant that, hey, Russia was given a green light to proceed on its own. Yes, I think that relationship is extraordinarily important, but I will also say this. We cannot permit, as has been happening, to Russia to appear once again with all the prowess of the Soviet Union in our minds. It's not. It has capability in what it calls the near abroad, Ukraine, Syria, on its borders, so to speak. But that fleet that it's moving around with, that aircraft carrier into the Mediterranean, my gosh, once it gets there, it's going to pull into a port and never get underway again. They are not the military that they were of old, and we should not build it up. Yet, nevertheless, where they have influence, we should have tried to work more closely with them, and we failed to do that.
Okay. Admiral Joe Sestak, it's always a pleasure to visit with you. Good to hear your voice again. I know you've been awfully busy. Let's get back together again and get on TV. I appreciate it, Joe. Thank you.
I would have enjoyed being on with you again, Ed. I really appreciate this opportunity. Take care.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Joe Sestak is a 30-year veteran of the United States military, worked in the Clinton White House, also worked in naval intelligence. Here with us on Ed Schultz News and Commentary. We're back tomorrow.